Welcome everyone. We are live on the AIER Authors Corner, where I interview different people from the wonderful organization that is the American Institute for Economic Research, and we chat about some of the awesome articles that have been coming out there. I am absolutely delighted to have on the show today Max Gulker. He's a senior research fellow at AIER, and he recently put out some great articles and a wonderful, really comprehensive report about Trump's war in trade, all of the tariffs and things that are going on, and how this has hurt the economy. So welcome to the show, Max.
Hi, Naomi. Nice to be here. Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you on here, and I wanted to really go in depth about what you said in this article. And just to start off with, so there's this great sentence here that kind of sums up the essence of what you wrote about. You said that this trade war has harmed virtually all Americans while failing to positively impact the industries supposedly being protected. So let's talk a little bit about that, because that's a very strong statement right there.
All right. Well, it is a strong statement, and it reflects how strongly we feel against the approach that the Trump administration has taken here. So my colleague Peter Earle and I wrote this paper, and let me unpack that sentence and start with the harm side. And so just in the amount of tariffs that were charged to American firms importing goods from overseas that were enacted last year, we're talking about $45 billion that went from U.S. firms to the U.S. Treasury and tax revenues. Now, that some of those can be will be suffered in the form of lost profits by those firms, and some of them will be passed along to consumers. But in either event, the administration touted its tax cut the year before of $75 billion as being this great thing for the economy. Well, they've effectively clawed back 2/3 of that by enacting these tariffs.
Right.
And we haven't even gotten to some of the other costs.
I'm going to put up a graph that basically illustrates what you're talking about here. So it's pretty significant when you're talking about clawing back some of these things. Like, a lot of people are saying, oh, well, it's hit and miss with Trump. There are some good things he's done for the economy. There are some bad things he's done. But, you know, all the tax cuts, that's been great, and all of that. Tariffs have been bad. But what you're essentially showing, and I'm putting that graph up right now, is that the war in trade has been so disastrous that really there has been no net benefit to the economy at all.
Right, and maybe we could say there's still been a little bit from the tax cuts, since we're talking about clawing back 2/3, but it's certainly far less than it would be had these tariffs not been enacted. And really, you can think about the two of them together, the tariffs and the income tax cut, or the tariffs and the corporate tax cut for that matter, as being a sort of free trade tax that's basically transferring money from companies who are doing business abroad, importing foreign goods, to companies that aren't. And so that's really what, in summation, holistically, the Trump administration's tax policy has been.
Absolutely, and it's really disappointing to see this. It is hurting a lot of people. Let's talk about some of the costs that this has incurred, because there are some very obvious costs that you think about, but there are all of these sort of unseen consequences. When you have dispersed costs across a whole group of the population, it really is hard to just pinpoint and say, well, this has been a bad policy. But you've done tremendous work in your research pinpointing and actually showing that when you're talking about, for example, supply chains being completely disrupted, the costs incurred by an organization, first of all, when they find out that the source, let's say the source of steel, it's now going up in price because they have to pay a huge amount of taxes. Like, do they now source it from somewhere else? That's a huge amount of labor coming from their workforce, you know, that they have to pay for. There are all of these things that completely disrupts organizations when something like this happens.
Yeah. Well, let me build off of something you said a minute ago, which is that there are dispersed benefits, or there are very focused benefits and dispersed costs throughout the economy of this policy. And unfortunately, this is why it's a lot easier to enact tariffs politically sometimes than it is to enact other kinds of taxes, because it's very easy to get one's mind around this steel plant in Pennsylvania is going to be saved because of this tariff, or they're not going to have to cut 50 jobs, or those kinds of things. Whereas the costs, which are always going to be higher than those benefits, are going to be divided among lots of people, and so you don't individually feel it as much, but the overall net effect on the economy is going to, in addition to those, essentially that $45 billion tax increase, you hit the nail on the head with the supply chains, that if people are changing their business, that's going to cause frictions and disruptions within firms. We haven't even gotten yet to the other side of the trade war, and the fact that other countries have enacted retaliatory tariffs against us. That's a huge cost right there.
It's incredibly huge, and it's getting kind of scary what's going on there. This war that has started, especially between China and the US. It's not good to see two countries that before were very peacefully dealing with each other, and there was a lot of cross movement across borders of all kinds of goods, and people were benefiting, getting tremendous value from this happening. And now that's really been shut down. The rhetoric is all about this, these punitive measures and things like that. Like, I mean, how does that change the economy when things like that start to happen?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we may have another case here of the president undermining his own diplomacy team's efforts, because just today I was reading that the negotiators that the president has sent to China and to receive the Chinese ambassadors in the U.S. Are saying all these great things about we're going to have a summit soon and we're about to have a deal, and then Trump today says, oh, if there's a deal, we're still going to leave most of the tariffs in place. They're not going away. So I can't imagine that would actually give the Chinese much incentive to make a deal when he's deploying rhetoric like that. And another thing on the economy as a whole that you're saying, well, first of all, the tariffs are going to make people relatively poorer, and that's going to depress economic activity. That's sort of an indirect economic cost that's difficult to estimate, but that we can't ignore. And then beyond that, we also have the uncertainty. And, financial markets never particularly like uncertainty. And right now, we have sort of the potential hanging over us of a worse trade war than we have right now if things escalate. And, the president and his team kind of giving mixed signals like that certainly doesn't help matters.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about what you just mentioned, this rhetoric, because a lot of people, pardon me, they dismiss what Trump's doing a little bit. And when he first started talking about this trade war, people are saying, oh, haven't you ever read The Art of the Deal? This is how he negotiates. You start in one extreme position that gives you some room to move there. And so that's what's been going on. He has this extreme position, but really he's come around and he's actually ended up enacting this extreme position, and a lot of people didn't expect this. So when you're talking about China just not believing him or not just not wanting to deal with him, if you say that all these tariffs are going to stay in place, I mean, his rhetoric is causing a huge amount of harm there.
Right. Well, one point that I think is really important that Pete and I make in the report is that this president doesn't see international trade, as a lot of individuals and firms in the United States doing business with a lot of individual firms in China or in another country. He sees it as a chess game, and he sees it as negotiation. And the sort of shrewdest and strongest leader, the person who can successfully execute the art of the deal, as you said, coming out on top. So, it becomes big surprise all about him. And then, even if these tariffs are a bargaining chip, and if they're a bargaining chip, I hope he extracts some really good things out of the Chinese and other countries, because this bargaining chip, like we said, has cost a huge amount to Americans. But in terms of what he's saying, even if it is a useful bargaining chip, he's undermining that by saying, well, we're not going to take them away, even if we do reach a trade deal.
I think it's such a great point that you bring up about this idea of a bargaining chip. And we're dealing with hundreds of millions of individuals who are trying to make decisions in their best interest and trying to negotiate the legal frameworks of different jurisdictions and the costs of all of the things that they have to deal with in their companies. And then we have, on the other side of things, like two governments that are making rules for all of the people within their countries, these blanket rules that they can change on a whim at any time. You know, there's a lot of ego involved, and there's a lot of you know, hubris of people who are saying, listen, we know what's best for all of you. We're going to make these deals, and it's going to be in your best interests. And, you know, that's a very problematic way to look at the economy. Like, you can make a blanket rule, and it's going to be in everyone's best interest. As this is proven, this has not been in anyone's best interest. This has hurt, or, as you said, almost all Americans.
Right. Well, it's, you know, in terms of the governments making rules for their citizens, you know, even if you don't want to say, okay, totally open borders, totally free trade, there's no, you know, even if you don't want to go all the way to that level, this degree of management combined with, as you said, ego, combined with this sort of heroic idea that that I'm going to go out for my country and negotiate the best deal, when the whole point of international trade is mutually beneficial, voluntary interactions between millions of consumers and firms, then it's, you know, I'll tell you, the one thing that's not operating here is the free market.
Absolutely. Now, the whole rhetoric, this whole rhetoric was, it had this protectionism air around it. That is what he was talking about in the election. He was pointing to specific industries, specific individuals, and saying, listen, this is going to help you, steel worker, for example. This is going to help your plant. It's going to help keep it open. And it was a very real, very tangible good that was going to be produced by this, you know, and it's very easy for politicians to highlight one person that's going to benefit from something and saying, that's why we need these rules for everyone, because it's going to benefit these people. Now, what benefit has it actually created for these people that he promised to protect? Right.
Well, the short answer is very little. And we took just a look at some very basic data on steel imports and steel production in the U.S. Along with aluminum. Those are the tariffs that have been in place for almost the longest of his entire litany of tariffs. And if a tariff is quote unquote successfully protecting an industry, one would expect to see imports go down and domestic production go up. That would be from the companies here in the United States saying, well, we're going to buy locally, we're going to buy domestically rather than import steel. And we show in the report that doesn't really seem to be happening. Imports do go down a little bit in 2018. Domestic production does go up a little bit in 2018. But if you zoom out and you look at the year-to-year fluctuations, they're well within the range of the up and down that we see every year. So if there's any impact on these industries, any positive impact, it can't be that big.
Absolutely. So I'm showing them a graph right now that shows how the tariffs have had a negligible effect on US steel imports. It starts in 2010. As you see, you mentioned it just goes up and down through all these years. They were enacted in 2017, after 2017, and you look at 2018. It's very clear from this chart that it's just well within the natural movements that were happening anyway. So not only did Trump fail to help protect these steelworkers that he said he was helping all along, and that's the reason for all of this, he has hurt so many businesses in the process. So, like, what costs do you estimate this has had to American consumers, American businesses, and the American economy?
Well, we have that $45 billion number, which we also frame as about 2/3 of the income tax cut that he had enacted the year before. There are several other costs, and I think we already talked about kind of the indirect economic costs, the uncertainty associated with, well, is this trade war going to get worse? And, you know, there's also a set of costs that are just changing the way people do business up and down their supply chain. So really we're estimating kind of a floor, kind of a lower bound on the overall costs.
It's really, really sad to see all of this happening when this could have easily been avoided, you know, and And you talked a little bit to me beforehand, a little bit about the people who are advising Trump about this. It doesn't seem like he has particularly free market people around him helping him create these policies.
Yeah, well, Peter Navarro and others who have surrounded him, who are economists, are very rare in the economics world, in that they subscribe to a form of what's kind of called neo-mercantilism. Now, mercantilism, I joke that this is sort of Washington's hipster throwback to the 1700s. So instead of 20 years ago, we're going several hundred years ago. But mercantilism was basically the idea that every country had to hoard treasure and keep the flows of treasure from the New World coming back to their country, and also export more than they import, have a positive trade balance. Well, everybody can't have a positive trade balance. And in fact, basically in the first sentence of The Wealth of Nations, authored in 1776, Adam Smith debunks mercantilism. So it's not surprising that, that generations of economists who have built on Adam Smith have embraced free trade and shied away from these ideas. Of course, he's gone out and found the one or two people who are going to tell him that, he's the powerful negotiator that he wants to be.
Absolutely. And we talk all this time, we hear it in the mainstream media about this trade deficit and how this trade deficit, I mean, it's a pejorative, the way that they're talking about it. One cannot have a trade deficit because that's terrible, and we have this trade deficit with China, and they go on and on about this. So what does that actually mean? That means that we're giving them a lot of money and they're bringing in a lot of goods, and apparently that's a bad thing, because consumers here are getting very cheap goods. I mean, I like the way John Stossel talks about this, how he says that, well, I have a trade deficit with my barber. I only ever give him money. He only ever gives me services. So that's a very strange concept to talk about, like that we somehow need to have that balance. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying I've got a pretty sweet trade surplus going with AIER, right? Because they pay me money and I give them my labor. So the money is flowing from AIER to me. And exactly like John Stossel says, and others with kind of the products that they purchase, it actually really highlights the kind of fallacy that people look at international trade as differently than Walmart or AIER or whoever you want to sort of make that example with, right? Because people say, well, that's absurd because, everybody in the economy trades and everything like that, but it's really no different when you're looking at another country. But people want to see it as basically the art of the deal instead of just all of this commerce going on.
And I love the way that in the article again you talk about these hundreds of millions of individuals, and that's really what the economy is. And I think that this is misconception, and that it's really not helpful the way that we think about this when we're thinking about governments making deals and they're single entities, and we don't realize that the economy is this incredibly complex beast, and it really deals with hundreds of millions of people, their own value systems, their own priorities, their own needs in their businesses, their own individual networks and the people that they're connecting to all over the world. And it's so much more complicated than politicians would have us believe when they talk about these policies that are going to fix things. And they don't seem to ever talk about how there are so many unintended consequences from all these things they enact.
Yep. Well, I think that big picture, that's one of the biggest challenge that those of us who advocate for free markets really face, is that our brains in some way want to reduce these big groups of people because we can't really intuitively get our head around it into some, cut down to size kind of model in our heads. And so, but when that model turns out to be the US does this and China does that, think about how much you lose just from the question that you were asking in terms of people's networks and their individual decisions and all of those things that you're essentially throwing out when you're thinking about that. And so it behooves us as economists, Peter and I writing this paper, to try to explain it in a way that that makes sense to people.
I want to talk about some of the ways that cryptocurrencies have helped different countries get away around things like sanctions. So sanctions obviously are policies that are created on the government level. They say you are allowed to do business with this person or you aren't allowed to do business with this person, giving, you know, certain people permissions. And cryptocurrency has been a way that people can avoid this sort of thing. Now, I'm not sure if you've looked into Bitcoin at all, but there's a lot of talk about, you know, obviously it gives people a lot more individual sovereignty over their money, so financial sovereignty, and it seems like this could be a tool that could enable and ease transactions across borders. So is this something that could help in something like a trade war?
In theory, it really could, and you know, it always amuses me, the debate kind of with Bitcoin and getting around sanctions, that people say, oh, it's bad because you can get around sanctions. And then people say it's good because you can get around sanctions. And it really, I would say in terms of a trade war, we can think of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies as kind of a firewall. That's not that close, to be honest, right now, just because most American consumers, businesses, Chinese consumers, businesses, people worldwide, most people haven't really comfortably adopted it yet. But as that adoption increases with time, then the sort of threat, the kind of justified threat from all of us, kind of gains a head of steam of, oh, you're going to charge all these tariffs? Well, we're going to find a way to transact that goes around that, right? Because there's a limit to what people are going to tolerate. So it may not be, you know, the same situation as a country that's rife with sanctions right now, that right now really has no other way to survive. But it is there, it is being adopted, and it is down the road something that could credibly kind of tie government's hands in this way, which I think is a great thing.
Absolutely, and I love what you're saying about this being regulatory arbitrage, because that's really how Bitcoin was created. It was created as this regulatory arbitrage. It was created to get away from these systems that are so gummed up and not working for people, and they wanted an alternative. They wanted a money that wasn't being controlled by elite people, and so I can definitely see that there are implications that this could have when you're dealing with international trade, and when you have individuals who really, I mean, this comes down to individuals wanting to transact with other individuals. You know, companies wanting to do business with other companies. They're figuring out their supply chain and making networks, making inroads and building relationships. And it can be really, really destructive to say to a company, you know, or basically force their hand and say, you can't deal with this person anymore. You have to build entirely new inroads. You have to put a huge amount of your time, investment into this. It's going to be a huge cost for you. I mean, this could be really disastrous. So if we're dealing with individual transactions between peers, I really love the idea of this going back to perhaps like a peer-to-peer currency, you know, something like that coming into play that gets us back to the roots of what you're saying, just like individuals dealing with other individuals.
It would be lovely, and I hope it happens. I think in terms of where we are in the U.S.-China trade war and where we are with Bitcoin right now, we're probably not there yet. But it is something that down the road really could constrain these things. And by the way, I want to add before I forget, Peter and I are listed as authors on this paper. We could not have done it without our excellent intern, Misha Gartz, who came to us all the way from Australia, from the folks at Mancal, who I believe you know.
I love Mancal. I'm actually an advisor on the Mancal Economic Education Foundation board.
Excellent.
And I'm very excited to see that they're sending people over to AIER, because it's just like two of my favorite organizations like joining forces. It makes me very happy to see that.
All right. Well, we were very happy to have two interns from there and to keep working with them in the future for sure.
Absolutely. Well, your report is really, really great, very comprehensive. You put a lot of work into this and just showing how destructive some of these policies can be. So I'm going to post a link in the video to let people know where they can go and read more about this, read some of your other writings about this. This is an incredibly important issue that I don't think people really keep up to date with enough. So just seeing these disastrous consequences, not just buying the rhetoric from mainstream media about this, but really going into the nitty-gritty and looking at the data, I think is so essential for people. So I just wanted to thank you, Max, for chatting with me, for putting this report together. It's been really, really fantastic.
No, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come on. You're right that people do need to follow this more, and we hope we can help.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to everyone in the chat who's been here tuning in. It's always lovely to have you all here. I see a lot of you are drinking tea, so that makes me delighted as well. But we will be here every week in the AIER Authors Corner, interviewing the wonderful people at AIER, looking at all of the latest articles they've been putting out. There's a link scrolling at the bottom of your screen. It shows you the website to go to where you can keep up to date with all the latest things going on in the news, and just, as I said, providing really great data for you to look at, and it's just such a wealth of information. So thank you to the fine people at AIER as well, and thank you to everyone for watching. We will see you next week.